The hail came sideways off the ridge a little after 9, and the diner's front window flexed under the wind like something alive and frightened. Dolores Hartley stood behind the counter with a coffee pot gone cold in her hand and watched 11 headlights swing off the highway and into her gravel lot. Low and growling, slick with rain, her heart climbed into her throat. She was 63 years old. She ran the last open kitchen for 40 miles. And every story she had ever been told about men who rode in formation through a storm ended badly. For the woman who answered the door, she did not lock it. That was the thing she would turn over in her mind for years. Afterward, the small hinge on which everything swung. Her hand went to the deadbolt, and then it came away. Outside, a man swung off the lead bike and stood in the downpour with his arms loose at his sides, making no move toward the glass. He just looked at the warm light, spilling out across the puddles the way a cold man looks at a fire he has not yet been invited to share. She crossed the floor and opened the door into the wind. Now pull back, because none of this makes sense without the years behind it. Dolores had owned the Ridgeline Diner for 31 years, since the summer her husband Raymond bought it with a handshake and a loan he never quite finished paying. Raymond had been gone 9 winters now. The diner sat alone at the mouth of a mountain pass where the interstate had been rerouted 2 decades back, taking the easy money with it, and leaving only the truckers who knew the old road and the locals who had nowhere better to be. She kept it open on stubbornness and pie. The pie was not a metaphor. People drove from 3 counties for her sour cherry and her brown butter pecan, and on a Good Friday she sold 40 of them, and on a bad Tuesday she sold the idea that someone in the world still made things by hand. The town was called Cobb Hollow, and it was dying the slow way. Towns die by subtraction. The mill had closed. The pharmacy had become a vape shop. And then nothing. What remained had arranged itself around a single fact that nobody said out loud, which was that the man who owned most of it now was named Garrett Voss, and he did not love the place so much as collect it. Voss had come up from the city 8 years back with soft hands and a development company and a smile that never reached his eyes. He bought the foreclosed lots. He bought the paper on the failing storefronts. He sat on the county zoning board, which was 3 people, 2 of whom owed him money. He wore pressed slacks to a diner that served gravy, and he tipped in coins to make a point about who was small and who was not. He called every woman over 50 by her first name on first meeting, the way a man does when he wants you to know. He sees no reason to be formal with you, and he never once raised his voice, because raising your voice is what you do when you are not sure you will win. Dolores had watched him buy her town the way a man buys a junked car for the parts, and she had watched the people of Cobb Hollow learn to smile at him because the alternative was worse. And she had hated that smile on their faces more than she hated anything he had ever done to her directly. The Ridgeline Diner sat on 4 acres at the mouth of the pass, and those 4 acres were the only thing in Cobb Hollow that Voss wanted and could not have. He had offered. He had offered low, the first time, the way you test a fence. He had offered again higher, with a lawyer in the room and a contract already drawn up, and a pen laid across it, pointing at her like a small accusation. The third time he had not offered at all. He had simply explained, in his level, reasonable voice, over a cup of coffee he did not drink, that the county was reassessing properties along the old highway corridor, and that a place as old as hers, with wiring as old as hers, might find itself on the wrong side of a code inspection. He had let the sentence sit there, unfinished, and the implied weight of it had hung heavy in the air between them. Then he had stood and buttoned his coat and left 2 coins on the counter for a $1.50 coffee and walked out into the sun. That was in the spring. By autumn, the inspections had begun. So, when 11 motorcycles came off the ridge in a hailstorm and rolled into her lot, Dolores was already a woman who had spent 6 months bracing for the worst thing the world could send her. She had simply been bracing for the wrong men. The first one through the door was huge. He filled the frame of it, water sheeting off a black leather cut, and for one long second, the only sound in the diner was the percussion of hail on the roof and the drip of him onto her clean floor. He was older than she expected, with a full iron-gray beard and deep lines cut around eyes that took in the whole room in a single sweep, the exits, the counter, the old woman standing her ground with a cold coffee pot. On the front of the cut, over his heart, a worn patch read President. Below it, stitched in faded thread, a stylized winged skull, and around it the words RO-A-D, Wardens. And under that, the rocker that named a charter she had never heard of. He looked at her for a moment, then he took off his gloves, slowly, one finger at a time, the way a man does when he wants you to see that his hands are empty. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low gravel rumble that she felt in the floorboards more than heard. "We've got a man down on the pass. Bike went out from under him on the ice. He's hurt and he's cold, and the road's closed both ways behind us. We saw your light." Dolores looked past him at the others, dismounting in the rain, and at the shape they were carrying between two of them, a younger man with a leg held wrong and a face the color of ash. "Bring him in," she said. Bring him to the booth by the heater. She did not decide to be brave. There was no decision in it. There was only the long habit of a woman who had spent 31 years feeding whoever came through that door and a boy who was hurt, and the simple arithmetic of warmth. They filled her diner. 11 of them, and the hurt one made 12, and they tracked water, and they smelled of rain and exhaust and old leather, and they were the most frightening collection of human beings she had ever willingly let inside her walls. And every one of them, she noticed, wiped his boots. Every one of them took off his sodden gloves and his dripping cut and hung them where they would not drip on her seats. The huge man, the president, directed it all with small economical gestures, a nod here, a flat hand there, and the others moved to his silence, like water finding its level. The hurt boy was named Tully, she learned, and he was 24, and his leg was broken below the knee. There was no ambulance coming. The pass was closed. The nearest hospital was over an hour out on a good day, and this was not a good day. So Dolores did what her mother had taught her, and her grandmother had taught her mother. She put water on to boil. She found her clean dish towels and the bottle of liniment under the register, and the wooden spoon she used for nothing in particular, and she knelt down by the boy with the broken leg, and she said, "This is going to hurt, and then it's going to hurt less." And a wiry man with hard, pale eyes crouched down across from her and met her gaze. "I've said bones," he said. It was not a request for permission. It was an offer of partnership. On his cut, the patch read, "Sergeant at Arms," and a thin white scar ran through his left eyebrow, and his name, she would learn, was Cutter, though no one explained the nickname, and she never asked. Together they straightened the boy's leg and splinted it against the wooden spoon and the leg of a chair, and the boy screamed once, and then breathed, and the room let out a breath it had been holding. Cutter's hands were steady the whole time, sure and clinical, and when it was done he sat back on his heels and looked at the splint, and then at Dolores and gave her one short nod, and that nod meant more to her than a sentence would have. And she found a clean wool blanket in the back, where she kept the lost and found, a blanket somebody had left behind 2 winters ago and never come back for, and she tucked it around the boy and she pressed the back of her hand to his cheek the way you do with a fever, an old reflex from raising a son. And the boy looked up at her with the helpless gratitude of someone too young to be in this much pain and said, "Thank you, ma'am," in a small voice, and something in her chest pulled tight. And then there was nothing to do but wait out the storm. 12 hard men and one small old woman in a diner at the edge of the world. The hail kept up its drumming on the metal roof, steady and dense, and the windows ran with water, and the neon of her sign buzzed and flickered against the dark like a thing struggling to stay lit. The men spread themselves through the booths and along the counter. A few of them dozed. 2 of them played a quiet game of cards, with a deck cutter produced from somewhere. No money on the table, just the soft slap of cards to pass the hours. Nobody turned on a phone. Nobody asked her for the Wi-Fi password or complained about the lack of a television. They sat in the warm and the dark and the smell of coffee like men who had learned a long time ago how to be still. And Dolores moved among them refilling cups, and the strangeness of it slowly wore down into something almost ordinary. So she did the only thing she knew how to do for people who were cold and frightened and trying not to show it. She baked. She had the dough for 6 pies already made and resting in the cooler, because she always did, because Raymond had taught her that a kitchen with no dough in it was a kitchen that had given up. She rolled it out on the marble slab he had bought her for an anniversary she could no longer place exactly, and she filled the shells with the cherries she had put up in July, and the apples a neighbor had traded her for a week of breakfasts, and she crimped the edges with the same 3 motions she had made 10,000 times. The flour rose in a pale cloud under her hands. She worked the rolling pin the way her grandmother had shown her, from the center out, never back and forth, turning the dough a quarter each time so it stayed round and even. And the old motions steadied her the way prayer steadies some people. The diner filled with the smell of butter and hot fruit and cinnamon, and it crowded out the smell of rain and fear. And one by one the hard men went quiet and watched the oven the way children watch a window on the first snow. She baked all 6. She did not think about whether she could afford to give away 6 pies worth of fruit she had canned with her own hands through a hot July. The thought did not enter her. There were cold men in her diner, and she had a warm oven, and the rest was just arithmetic she chose not to do. She pulled the first pair out when the crusts went gold and set them steaming on the counter to cool, and the men watched her cut them, and she gave the first slice to the boy with the broken leg, and the second to the oldest man she could see, and she went down the room that way, oldest to youngest, until every man in the place had a plate. The president sat at the counter the whole time. He did not speak much. He drank the coffee she set in front of him, the fresh pot, and he watched her hands work, and once he said in that low rumble, "My grandmother made pies out in the Dakotas, sour cherry, like that one. I haven't smelled that in 50 years. Then this one's yours," Dolores said. And she meant it the way you mean a thing you do not yet understand the size of. The storm broke a little before 3 in the morning. The hail had long since softened to rain, and then to nothing, and the wind had laid down, and through the front window the sky over the ridge showed the first bruise of gray. The pass would still be closed for hours, but the worst of it had passed, and the boy Tully was sleeping with his splinted leg propped on a cushion and color back in his face, and 12 men had eaten 6 pies down to the tins, and drunk most of 2 pots of coffee, and not one of them had raised his voice or laid a hand on anything that was not offered. When the president finally stood to leave, he did a thing that Dolores did not expect. He reached into the inner pocket of his cut and brought out a roll of bills, and she stepped back from it, as if it were hot. "No," she said. "No, you don't pay me for a storm. I don't take money for a storm. My husband would climb out of his grave." The big man looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, some calculation that had nothing to do with money. He put the roll away. "What's your name?" he asked. "Dolores Hartley. Reese Calloway." He did not offer his hand, because his hands, she understood now, were a thing he kept to himself out of an old courtesy. "You opened your door to 12 strangers in a storm and set my brother's leg and fed us and wouldn't take a dime." He let that sit. "Folks don't do that anymore. I want you to remember that you did." Then they were gone, the engines fading down the wet highway, and Dolores stood alone in a diner that smelled of cherries and cinnamon. And she swept the floor, and she went home, and she told herself it was a strange night, and nothing more. She was wrong about that. She was wrong in the best way a person can be wrong. She did not see them again for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Voss tightened the screws. The first code citation came on a Monday, slid under her door in a county envelope, and it cited her for a ventilation hood that had passed inspection every year for 31 years. The fine was $400. The second citation came on Thursday and concerned the slope of her wheelchair ramp, which had been built to spec by a contractor Voss himself had recommended, a fact the citation did not mention. The third concerned her grease trap. The fourth, her signage. Each one carried a fine, and each fine carried a deadline, and the deadlines were stacked so close together that paying one meant falling behind on the next. The inspector who came to write them was a thin, nervous man named Pell, who would not look her in the eye. He had eaten her meatloaf for years. He had once told her it was better than his late mother's, and she had pretended not to see him wipe his eyes when he said it. Now he stood in her kitchen with a clipboard and a tape measure and a misery he could not hide, measuring the slope of a ramp he knew was fine, writing down a hood violation he knew was invented, and when he was done he said, very low, so low she almost missed it, "I'm sorry, Dolores. I've got 2 kids. He holds the note on my house." And then he left, and she understood that Voss had not simply bought the buildings of Cobb Hollow. He had bought its people, one mortgage and one debt at a time, until every hand that might have helped her was a hand that owed him. She understood the shape of it. It was not about the fines. The fines were the saw, and she was the tree. And Voss was a patient man with all winter to cut. When she could not pay, there would be a lien. When there was a lien, there would be a forced sale. And when there was a forced sale, there would be exactly one bidder, a man with soft hands in a development company, buying the last 4 acres he did not own for pennies on the dollar she had bled into the ground for 3 decades. She went to the county office. She put on the good blue dress she wore to funerals, and she drove 40 minutes to the squat brick building where the records were kept, and she sat across a laminate desk from a woman with a county lanyard, who would not meet her eyes, and was told that everything was procedural, everything was by the book, everything was simply the way the code worked. She asked to appeal. She was given a form. She asked when the appeal would be heard. She was told the appeals were heard by the zoning board. She asked who sat on the zoning board, though she already knew, and the woman behind the desk said the name Voss, along with 2 others, and then the woman looked down at her hands, and that was the whole conversation. She drove home in the dark with her hands shaking on the wheel. The official systems of her county had a door, and she had walked through it, and behind it there was nothing but more doors, all of them locked, all of the keys in the soft hand of one man. She told no one. There was no one to tell. Her son was 3 states away and had his own troubles, and her friends were as poor and as tired as she was, and the men who might have helped her in another life were dead or gone. She sat alone at her own counter after closing, with the citations spread out in front of her, and she did the arithmetic over and over, and it never came out any way but ruin. It was on the worst of those nights, with the diner dark and the figures bleeding red, that she heard the engines. She knew the sound before she saw the lights. One bike, this time, not 11. It rolled into the lot, slow and deliberate, and parked under the buzzing neon. And a wiry man with a scar through his left eyebrow swung off it and came to the door and knocked. Gentle with one knuckle cutter, the sergeant-at-arms, she let him in. He took in the spread of paper on the counter, the way Reese had taken in the room that first night. A single sweep, missing nothing. "You look like a woman who hasn't slept," he said. "I'm fine." "No," he said, not unkindly. "You're not." He nodded at the citations. "May I?" She did not know why she let him. Maybe because he had knelt in the dirt of her floor and helped her set a boy's leg, and never once made her feel small. She slid the papers across the counter. He read them slowly, all of them, and his pale eyes went very still, and when he was done he gathered them into a neat stack and squared the edges and set them down. "Who's doing this to you?" he asked. She told him, all of it. The offers and the third visit and the unfinished sentence about the wiring and the inspections that started the very next season. She told him about Voss and the zoning board and the woman at the county who would not meet her eyes. It came out of her in a flood, 6 months of it, and Cutter listened without moving. And when she was done, the diner was very quiet. "I'm not asking you to do anything," she said quickly, suddenly afraid of what she had set in motion. "I shouldn't have told you. This isn't your trouble." Cutter stood. He pulled out his phone and took a photograph of each citation, one at a time, methodical, and then he squared the stack again and slid it back to her. "Reese told you to remember what you did," he said. "Now you're going to remember what we do." He did not finish the thought. He did not need to. He walked out into the night, and the single engine fired and faded, and Dolores sat alone, with a fresh and unfamiliar feeling rising in her chest, something she had not let herself feel in 6 months. It was not quite, it was the absence of the certainty of doom. For now, that was enough. What happened next, she pieced together only later, from fragments, because the road wardens did not explain themselves, and she learned not to ask. There was a young man in the club, younger even than the boy whose leg she had set, and they called him Specs, and what Specs could do with a laptop frightened the older members more than any rival ever had. Specs did not break into anything. He would have told you that himself, with a kind of offended pride. He did not need to. He simply read what was already public and saw what other people did not bother to see. He read the minutes of the county zoning board, which were public, going back 9 years. He read the property records, which were public. He read the campaign finance filings for the 2 county commissioners who served alongside Voss on the zoning board, and the incorporation documents for the shell company that held the paper on half the foreclosed lots in Cobb Hollow, and the deed transfers that moved property from desperate owners to that shell company at prices that told their own story. He cross-referenced the dates. He built a timeline on a long roll of butcher paper taped across the wall of the clubhouse back room, votes in black ink, money in red, and he stood back from it and saw the pattern leap out the way a face leaps out of a crowd once you know to look. None of it was hidden. All of it was simply scattered, 1,000 dry pieces and 1,000 dull filings, and no one had ever sat down with the patience to gather the pieces into a single picture. Specs gathered them, and the picture they made was a crime. The two commissioners who voted with Voss on every assessment had both, within 60 days of key votes, received loans from the shell company that they had never disclosed. One of them had bought a lake house worth more than 4 years of his county salary. The other had quietly paid off a gambling debt that was itself a matter of public record because of a small claims judgment filed against him by a casino 2 counties over. The reassessments that were strangling Dolores were not procedural at all. They were a machine, built deliberately, oiled with undisclosed money, designed to manufacture distress and then harvest it. And every gear of that machine left a paper trail because men like Voss believed, down to their bones, that the paper protected them. They had filed everything correctly. They had crossed every legal T. They had never once imagined a reader patient enough to follow the trail all the way to its end, because the patience to do that was a working-class virtue, and they had spent their whole lives certain that working people did not have the time. Specs only built the picture, though. The road wardens did not deal in pictures. They dealt in consequence, delivered in person, and the delivery was Reese Calloway's to make. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early November when the engines came back to Cobb Hollow, and this time the whole town heard them. Voss was holding court at the diner, as it happened, which was the kind of irony nobody could have arranged on purpose. He had taken to coming in on Tuesdays to remind Dolores of his patience. He sat in the corner booth, the one by the window, with his pressed slacks and his coffee he never finished, and he had brought a man with a briefcase, and the briefcase held the papers that would begin the lien. He was midway through explaining to Dolores in his level, reasonable voice exactly how sorry he was that it had come to this, telling her there were programs for women her age, that she would be comfortable, that this was really a kindness if she could only see it, when the sound rolled in off the highway and the cups rattled on the counter. 11 motorcycles. 12 men. They came in formation down the old highway, and they turned into the gravel lot in a wide, disciplined arc, chrome catching the cold afternoon light, and they shut their engines down one after another until the silence they left behind was louder than the noise had been. Voss looked up from his papers. The color of his face began very slowly to change. The door opened and Reese Calloway filled it. Iron-gray beard, the Pasdian patch over his heart, the winged skull of the road wardens, and behind him came Cutter with his scarred brow. And behind Cutter came the others, and they did not crowd, and they did not shout. They simply came inside and arranged themselves around the room with the unhurried confidence of men who have never once in their lives had to hurry, and the diner that had felt cavernous and empty for years was suddenly completely full. Reese walked to the corner booth. He did not look at Voss at first. He looked at Dolores. "Ma'am," he rumbled, "is this man bothering you?" Dolores opened her mouth and found she could not speak, so she did not. She simply looked at Voss, the man who had spent 6 months teaching her how small she was, and for the first time she let him see that she was not afraid. Reese turned to Voss. Then he did not lean over him. He did not raise his voice. He pulled out the chair across the booth, the one the briefcase man had vacated by sliding silently against the wall, and he sat down, and he set a manila folder on the table between them and squared its edges with 2 thick fingers. "Garrett Voss," he said, and he said the whole of the name, slow and deliberate, the way you read a sentence off a charge sheet. "We need to talk about your patience." "I don't know who you think you are," Voss began, and his voice was still level, Still reasonable, but a thread had come loose in it. But I have friends in this county. I have people. You can't just walk in here and do this. Open the folder, Reese said. Voss did not open the folder, so Cutter reached across, unhurried, and opened it for him, and turned it to face the man and stepped back. What was in the folder was not a threat. There was not a single threatening word in it. It was paper, the same weapon Voss himself had chosen, used better. It was the loan records and the undisclosed disbursements, and the dates laid against the dates of the votes. It was the lake house, and the gambling judgment and the deed transfers at pennies on the dollar. It was on the final page, a single sheet that listed the names and direct lines of 3 people, a reporter at the state capitol who had spent 2 years on county corruption, an investigator at the state attorney general's office, and the chairwoman of the state ethics commission. What? Indicating that each had already received a copy of everything in the folder, time-stamped that very morning. What happened to Voss's face was the thing Dolores remembered longest, longer than the engines, longer than the folder. It did not crumple. It is too easy to say it crumpled. What it did was empty. Every expression he had spent 8 years building the level reason, the patient smile, the soft contempt, drained out of it all at once and left nothing behind but a frightened man who had just understood, fully and forever, that the systems he had trusted to protect him had been turned around and were now pointed at his chest. He had built his whole life on the certainty that the paper was on his side. He had never once imagined the paper changing sides. He had never imagined a folder he had not assembled himself. "You're going to do 3 things, Reese said, and his voice never rose above the rumble. You're going to drop every citation against this woman by Friday. Every one. You're going to resign your seat on that zoning board today, in writing, and you're going to sell back every lot you stole in this town at the price you paid the desperate people you stole it from. And then you're going to leave Cobb Hollow, and you are never going to come back." He paused, or he said, "You can take your chances with the 3 people on that last page, your choice. But you should know that I'd prefer the second one." Personally, he did not finish that thought either. He did not have to. Voss made a sound that was not a word. The briefcase man was already gone, had slipped out the door at some point no one quite marked, the way rats leave a thing before it goes down. Voss gathered his papers with hands that would not work right. He stood. He looked once around the room at the wall of leather and silence, and at the small old woman behind the counter who had baked him no pie and never would, and he understood that there was no door in this room that opened onto anything but his own ruin. He fled into the afternoon. The light outside was flat and bright and merciless, the kind of clean daylight his whole world was built on, and it swallowed him as he hurried to his car, and the engine of it sounded thin and small against the silence the road wardens had brought. And then he was gone down the old highway. In a way, it had not been for 8 years free of him. He did the 3 things. He did them all that week, because the alternative had 3 phone numbers on it. The citations vanished, every one of them, withdrawn in a single county letter that offered no explanation and needed none. The resignation was filed on a Wednesday, 2 lines long, citing personal reasons. The inspector named Pell came back to the diner the following Monday, and he did not have a clipboard, and he ordered the meatloaf. And when Dolores set it down in front of him, he could not look at her, and she squeezed his shoulder once and told him to eat his lunch, and that was the whole of the apology. Either of them needed. And over the next 2 months, lot by lot, the stolen pieces of Cobb Hollow went back to the people they had been taken from, at the price they had been taken for, and a reporter at the state capitol began making calls about 2 county commissioners and a lake house and a gambling debt, and the slow machinery of an actual reckoning. The kind that wears a tie and carries a subpoena began to turn. Voss was never charged with anything in the end. Men like him rarely are. He was finished in that county all the same, stripped of the board seat and the soft power and the smile, and he never set foot in Cobb Hollow again. And for the people who lived there, that was justice enough. That is not where the story ends, though, because the story was never really about Voss. He was only weather, and weather passes. The story was about a door, and the woman who did not lock it, and what comes back to a person across the long years when they answer the world with kindness. At the moment, kindness costs them the most. On a cold, bright Saturday in December, the engines came back to the Ridgeline Diner one last time, and Dolores met them at the door, and this time she was not afraid at all. Reese Calloway swung off the lead bike, and behind him came Cutter and Specs and a dozen others, and being carefully helped down from the back of one bike, with a cast on his leg and a grin on his face, came young Tully, walking now, slow, but walking. They filled her diner the way they had that first night, and this time there was no storm and no hurt boy and no fear, only a long afternoon of coffee and the 6 pies she had baked since dawn, knowing somehow they would come. Tully eased himself into the booth by the heater, the same booth, and he caught her eye and patted the cast on his leg and grinned, and she came over and signed it with the grease pencil she used to mark the specials board, just her name, Dolores, in the round hand she had been taught in a one-room school 60 years gone. And the boy looked at it like it was worth something. Specs showed her, shy about it, the printout of a newspaper story from the state capitol, 2 columns about a county commissioner and a lake house, and he did not say his own part in it, and she did not ask, but she put her hand flat on his shoulder for a moment, and he went red to his ears. And when the light began to slant gold through the front window, Reese stood, and the room went quiet the way it did when he stood, and he reached into his cut, and Dolores braced herself to refuse the roll of bills again. It was not money. It was a patch. He laid it on the counter in front of her. It was small, and it was hand-stitched, and it read, in plain thread, RIDGIN, and below it, Friend of the Wardens, and below that, a small winged skull no bigger than a quarter. "There's a thing we do," Reese said, "for the ones who are ours to look after. We don't do it often. We've done it twice in 20 years. He nodded at the patch. "You sew that inside your door where you can see it, and nobody else can. And you remember that this kitchen has 11 engines behind it now. Anybody comes through that door, meaning you harm you don't call the county." The lines around his eyes deepened, which was as close as he came to a smile. "You call us." Dolores picked up the patch. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed more than the diner. She did not make a speech. She was not a woman who made speeches. She turned to the oven, and she took out the last pie of the day. Sour, cherry, the crust gone deep gold, the fruit bubbling dark through the vents she had cut with the same 3 motions her grandmother had used. And she set it down in front of Reese Calloway, and she said the only thing there was to say. "This one's yours," she told him. "Like I told you, it always was." And the men of the road wardens ate pie in a warm diner at the mouth of a mountain pass, while the December light went down gold and then blue outside the window, and somewhere down the old highway a soft-handed man drove away from a town that was no longer his to take, and a small old woman who had opened her door to strangers in a storm sewed a patch inside that same door where she alone could see it, and she felt for the first time in 9 winters, that she was not standing watch over the ridgeline alone. She locked up that night out of habit, and then she stood for a moment in the dark with her hand flat against the door and the little patch beneath it, and she could still smell the cherries and the cinnamon and the rain that had started up again, soft, on the roof. It smelled like belonging. It smelled like a debt that ran both ways and would never be settled and never needed to be. It smelled, after all these years, like home. If this story warmed something in you, if it reminded you that the smallest kindness can come back around carrying more than you ever gave, then stay a moment, leave a word below, and pass it on to someone who needs to believe that decency still keeps its promises. Thank you for listening.